Chapter 5, Unit 5, Factor Markets. 5.1 Introduction to Factor Markets. What is a factor market, and why should you care? Let's start with a quick mental shift. For most of this course, you've been thinking about markets where goods and services are bought and sold, where a consumer walks into a store, picks up a product, pays a price, and walks out. Those are called product markets, sometimes called output markets. But there's a whole other world of markets running underneath that one, and it's the subject of Unit 5. These are factor markets, and they are the markets where the inputs to production, land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurship are bought and sold. On the AP exam, College Board will expect you to be fluent in both worlds, and the key is understanding how they mirror each other in some ways and diverge in others. Here's an analogy that really makes this click. Think about a pizza restaurant. In the product market, the restaurant sells pizza to customers. That's the output. But to make that pizza, the restaurant has to buy ingredients, hire workers, rent kitchen space, and purchase ovens. All of those transactions happen in factor markets. The restaurant, which was a seller in the product market, becomes a buyer in the factor market. And the workers, who are buyers in the product market when they purchase groceries on the weekend, become sellers in the factor market when they offer their labor to the restaurant. This flip in roles, firms as demanders, households as suppliers, is one of the most important conceptual anchors in all of Unit 5, and it's something the AP exam loves to test in tricky multiple-choice questions. The factors of production. College Board expects you to know the 4 factors of production and their associated payments. Land encompasses all natural resources, not just real estate, but timber, water, oil, farmland, and the payment for land is called rent. Labor is the human effort, both physical and mental, that goes into production, and workers earn wages. Capital refers to physical capital, machinery, equipment, buildings, tools used in the production process, and the payment for capital is called interest, or sometimes a return on capital. Finally, entrepreneurship is the organizational ability and risk-taking that combines the other factors, and entrepreneurs earn profit. When the AP exam asks about resource markets or factor markets, these are the categories they're working within. One common trap to watch for: students often confuse physical capital with financial capital. When economists talk about capital as a factor of production, they mean physical capital, the machines, the ovens, the trucks. Financial capital, like stocks and bonds, is not a factor of production in the microeconomics sense. Don't let that terminology slip past you on a multiple-choice question. Derived demand, the heart of factor markets. Now here's the concept that will follow you through all of Unit 5 and that separates students who get 4s from students who get 5 seconds. Derived demand. The demand for factors of production is derived from the demand for the goods or services those factors help produce. Workers at a car factory are hired not because the factory owner particularly wants workers for their own sake, but because consumers want cars. The demand for auto workers is derived from the demand for automobiles. Think about what this means in practice. If Americans suddenly fall in love with electric vehicles and demand for EVs surges, what happens in the labor market for electrical engineers and battery technicians? Their wages rise, their employment expands. Nothing changed about the workers themselves. The shift came entirely from the product market, filtered down into the factor market. This derived demand relationship is why you can't fully understand factor markets without also understanding product markets. Unit 5 builds directly on Unit 2's supply and demand framework and Unit 3's theory of the firm. This also explains why certain workers earn extraordinary wages. A star athlete doesn't earn millions because physical exercise is inherently valuable. They earn it because millions of fans are willing to pay to watch them perform, which means the team derives enormous revenue from that player's contribution. Derived demand is the link between consumer preferences and the paychecks workers bring home. The structure of this unit, what's coming, understanding that factor markets have demand and supply sides, just like product markets, sets up everything that follows in Unit 5. The demand side of a factor market comes from firms, specifically from their calculation of how much additional output a worker or unit of capital adds to their revenue. This leads directly into the concepts of marginal product of labor and marginal revenue product, which you'll master in Section 5.2. The supply side of labor markets involves households deciding how many hours to offer at different wage rates. The graphs you'll need to draw in this unit look similar to supply and demand diagrams from Unit 2, but they'll have labor or land or capital on the horizontal axis and wages or rent on the vertical axis. The firm's demand curve for labor will slope downward because of the law of diminishing marginal returns you studied in Unit 3, and the labor supply curve will typically slope upward, reflecting that higher wages attract more workers into a given market. You won't draw the full graph in this introductory section, but having that picture in your head from the start gives you a scaffold onto which every subsequent concept will attach cleanly. Connecting back to what you already know. One of the most elegant things about AP Microeconomics is how tightly everything connects. The diminishing marginal returns concept from Unit 3 directly explains why the demand for labor slopes downward. The perfectly competitive firm you studied in Unit 3 has an analog here, a perfectly competitive factor market where individual firms and workers are price takers in the wage. The monopoly concepts from Unit 3 reappear here in the form of monopsony, a market with a single buyer of labor, which you'll encounter later in Unit 5. Every tool you've already built gets repurposed, so if you feel shaky on production theory or market structures, now is a great time to review those sections before you go deeper into Unit 5. The big picture takeaway for this introduction is deceptively simple. Factor markets work on the same logic as product markets: supply, demand, equilibrium, but the players have switched roles and the demand for inputs is always secondary to the demand for the final product. Lock in that framework now, because Section 5.2 is going to put serious analytical muscle behind it as we dive into exactly how firms decide how many workers to hire. 5.2 Changes in factor demand and factor supply. Let's talk about what makes labor markets, and really any resource market, move. You've already learned that factor markets work like product markets in many ways, but the forces that shift supply and demand here have their own unique flavor, and the AP exam loves to test whether you truly understand the difference. So grab your coffee, because we're going to walk through every shift factor, every graph, and every trap the College Board has waiting for you. What shifts factor demand? Remember that factor demand is derived demand. Firms don't hire workers because they enjoy the company. They hire workers to produce output that consumers want to buy. That insight is your North Star for every question about shifting factor demand. The first and most tested shifter is a change in the demand for the output itself. If Americans suddenly fall in love with artisanal pizza, pizzerias want more workers. The demand curve for pizza chefs shifts right. Wages and employment both rise. On your graph, you draw a standard downward-sloping factor demand curve, labeled MRP for marginal revenue product. Then shift the entire curve to the right. The new equilibrium shows a higher wage and more workers hired. Now flip it. If consumers stop buying as much, output demand falls, MRP falls, and the factor demand curve shifts left. This output demand to factor demand chain is the single most important idea in this section. The second major shifter is a change in the productivity of the resource itself. Recall that MRP equals marginal product times output price, written as MRP equals MP times P. If technology improves, say a better espresso machine for our baristas, each worker produces more per hour, MP rises, and so MRP rises. The entire factor demand curve shifts, right? On your AP exam diagram, label the vertical axis wage W and the horizontal axis quantity of labor L, and show the MRP curve shifting outward. The same logic applies to education and training. A more skilled workforce has higher marginal product, so firms are willing to pay more, and the demand for that type of labor increases. The third shifter is the price of related inputs, and this is where students often stumble. You need to distinguish between substitutes in production and complements in production. If two resources are substitutes, say robots and assembly line workers, then when the price of robots falls, firms substitute robots for workers and the demand for workers falls. The MRP curve shifts left. But if two resources are complements, like truck drivers and trucks when trucks become cheaper, firms buy more trucks and therefore need more drivers. So the demand for drivers actually rises. The College Board loves to give you a scenario and ask which way demand shifts. Always ask yourself first whether the other input is a substitute or a complement. What shifts factor supply? Now let's look at the supply side. Factor supply curves are upward sloping. At higher wages, more people are willing to enter a labor market. What shifts that whole curve? The first major shifter is a change in the size of the eligible worker population. More immigration into a field, more people aging into the workforce, or relaxed licensing requirements can all increase labor supply, shifting the curve right, which pushes wages down and employment up. Think about how the expansion of nursing schools increased the supply of nurses over the past 2 decades. Wages stayed relatively stable despite surging healthcare demand, precisely because supply was also growing. The second shifter is a change in workers' preferences or non-wage factors of the job. If working conditions become safer, or if remote work options are added, the job becomes more attractive at any given wage and supply increases. Conversely, if a job gains a social stigma or becomes more physically demanding, supply falls. These are the amenity effects that behavioral economists love, and the AP exam occasionally tests them in the context of compensating differentials. Workers require higher wages to accept nastier jobs, so those occupations have higher wages in equilibrium. The third supply shifter is a change in the prices or opportunities in alternative labor markets. If the wages in software engineering skyrocket, some people who might have taught high school math go become programmers instead. The supply of math teachers falls, shifting that supply curve left. You draw this as the supply curve shifting leftward, with a new equilibrium showing a higher wage but lower quantity of teachers employed, all else equal. The fourth supply shifter is a change in the required education, training, or licensing. If your state adds a new certification requirement for electricians, fewer people enter the profession, supply decreases, and wages rise. This is why licensing boards are sometimes described as having a cartel-like effect on labor markets. Graph mastery, the factor market diagram. For the AP exam, your standard factor market graph needs 5 labeled elements. The vertical axis labeled wage, or more generally resource price. The horizontal axis labeled quantity of labor, or quantity of resource. A downward sloping demand curve labeled MRP, or just D. An upward sloping supply curve labeled S. And the equilibrium point where they cross, giving you W and L. When a demand shifter hits, redraw the MRP curve and identify the new equilibrium. When a supply shifter hits, redraw the S curve. The exam will often ask you to identify the direction of change in both the wage and quantity. You must state both. Common MCQ traps and FRQ scoring points. Here's the trap that catches the most students, confusing a movement along the factor demand curve with a shift of the curve. A change in the wage rate causes a movement along the existing MRP curve. Everything else we've discussed, output demand, productivity-related input prices, causes the whole curve to shift. If an MCQ says wages in this industry increased, that's telling you the equilibrium changed, not that demand shifted. You need to figure out why wages change from context. A second classic trap involves the direction of the productivity effect. Students sometimes think higher wages make workers more productive, which can be true in efficiency wage theory, but for AP Micro purposes, productivity changes are a cause of shifts in factor demand, not a result of wage changes. Keep the causation arrow pointing the right way. On FRQs, the College Board awards separate points for correctly drawing the shift, correctly identifying the new wage, and correctly identifying the new quantity of employment. Never assume you can earn the new equilibrium point without explicitly labeling it, and always use the vocabulary. The MRP curve shifts rightward, earns more credit than demand goes up. Connections to other units. This topic connects everywhere. From Unit 3, you know that the MRP formula links output market priced to factor demand. When a firm gains monopoly power in the output market, it produces less, which means it hires fewer workers and factor demand falls. From Unit 2, elasticity concepts apply here too. The wage elasticity of labor demand depends on the availability of substitutes and the labor cost share of total production, ideas the exam occasionally probes. And from Unit 6, market failure, factor market distortions like minimum wages set above equilibrium create surpluses, unemployment, following the same logic as price floors in product markets. With the mechanics of shifting supply and demand firmly in hand, you're ready to explore what happens when the market for a factor isn't perfectly competitive, because in Unit 5.3, we'll meet the monopsonist, a single buyer of labor with some very interesting and very testable power over wages. 5.3 Profit maximizing behavior in perfectly competitive factor markets. The core idea, firms as buyers, not just sellers. You've spent a lot of time thinking about firms selling goods in product markets. Now flip the script. In factor markets, firms are the buyers. They're purchasing inputs like labor, land, and capital to produce those goods. And here's the beautiful thing. The same profit-maximizing logic you already know applies perfectly here. Firms keep buying a factor as long as what they gain from it exceeds what it costs them. When those two things are equal, you stop. That's the whole story. But let's unpack every layer of it, because the AP exam loves to test the details. Marginal revenue product, what a worker is worth to a firm. The centerpiece of this entire section is a concept called marginal revenue product, or MRP. Think of it this way. You run a pizza shop and you're deciding whether to hire another delivery driver. That driver will deliver some additional number of pizzas per hour. That's their marginal physical product, MPP, also called marginal product of labor, MPL. But you don't care about pizzas in the abstract. You care about revenue. So you multiply that driver's extra pizzas by the price you receive for each pizza, and suddenly you know exactly how much additional revenue that one worker generates for you. That dollar figure is their marginal revenue product. The formula is clean and essential. MRP equals MPP times MR, where MR is the marginal revenue the firm earns in the product market. Now here's where perfect competition does something elegant. In a perfectly competitive product market, price equals marginal revenue. The firm is a price taker in the goods market, so MR equals P. This means the formula simplifies to MRP equals MPP times P. You'll see this written as MRPL equals MPPL times P for labor specifically. Memorize this. The AP exam will give you a table of workers, output levels, and a product price, and ask you to calculate MRP. Take the change in output, that's your MPP, multiply by the product price, and you have it. Marginal factor cost. What a worker actually costs. Now, for the other side of the equation, the cost of hiring one additional unit of a factor is called marginal factor cost, MFC, sometimes also called marginal resource cost, MRC, in a perfectly competitive factor market. And this is the critical condition for this section. The firm is a price taker in the input market, too. There are so many buyers and sellers of labor, for example, that no single firm can influence the wage rate. The wage is set by the market, and the firm simply accepts it. This means that for every additional worker you hire, the cost is exactly the same, the market wage. So in a perfectly competitive factor market, MFC equals the factor price, the wage rate, for labor. The MFC curve is a horizontal line just like the demand curve facing a perfectly competitive firm in the product market. That parallel is not a coincidence. It's the same price-taking logic operating on the input side. The profit-maximizing decision rule, MRP equals MFC. Here comes the decision rule you absolutely must know. A profit-maximizing firm hires factors of production up to the point where MRP equals MFC. If MRP is greater than MFC, hiring one more worker adds more to revenue than it adds to cost, so you hire. If MRP is less than MFC, that last worker costs more than they bring in, so you don't hire, or you let someone go. You stop exactly at MRP equals MFC. This is the factor market version of the P equals MC or MR equals MC rule, from product markets. Different surface, same underlying logic. Drawing and interpreting the graph. The graph for this section is something you must be able to draw from scratch on the FRQ. Here's how to build it. On the horizontal axis, put the quantity of the factor, say quantity of labor workers. On the vertical axis, put dollars, representing both MRP and MFC. The MRP curve slopes downward from left to right. Why? Because of diminishing marginal returns. As you add more workers, each additional worker adds less to output than the one before, so their MRP falls. This is a direct connection back to Unit 3, where you studied production and costs. The MFC curve in a perfectly competitive factor market is a perfectly horizontal line drawn at the market wage rate. The intersection of MRP and MFC gives you the optimal quantity of the factor to hire, which you label Q on the horizontal axis. The wage rate is labeled W on the vertical axis. That's your complete graph. Label everything, axes, curves, the equilibrium point, Q on W. Edge cases and common exam traps. Here's where students lose points, so pay close attention. First, the trap of confusing the product market structure with the factor market structure. This section is specifically about perfectly competitive factor markets, meaning the firm takes the factor price as given. If the firm has market power in the labor market, a monopsony situation, that's a different section, the MFC curve is no longer horizontal. Don't apply monopsony logic here. Second, when calculating MRP from a table, students often use total output instead of the change in output. MPP is always the additional output from one more unit of the factor. It's a marginal concept. Third, remember that the MRP curve itself is the firm's factor demand curve. The AP exam will sometimes ask, What curve represents the firm's demand for labor? The answer is the MRP curve, because it shows how much the firm is willing to pay for each unit of labor. Connections across the course. This topic is a hub connecting several units. The downward slope of MRP ties directly to diminishing marginal returns from Unit 3. The wage rate being set by market supply and demand connects to Unit 5's broader discussion of factor market equilibrium. And the MRP equals MFC rule is structurally identical to the MR equals MC rule in Unit 3 and 4. If you understand one, you understand both. On FRQs, you may be asked to show how a change in the product price shifts the MRP curve. If the price of pizza rises, MRP rises at every quantity of labor, shifting the entire MRP curve upward, which means the firm demands more workers at the same wage. That chain of reasoning from product price to MRP to labor demand is a classic multi-part FRQ sequence. With the firm's individual hiring decision firmly in hand, you're ready to zoom out and see how all those individual decisions aggregate into the market-level picture of factor supply and demand, which is exactly where we're headed next. 5.4 Monopsony. What is a monopsony? All right, let's flip the script. You've spent time thinking about monopoly, a single seller with market power on the output side. Now we're going to look at the mirror image, a single buyer with market power on the input side. That's a monopsony, and it's one of the most beautifully counterintuitive topics on the AP Microeconomics exam. Picture a small mining town in the middle of nowhere. There's exactly one coal company in that town, and if you want a job, that's your only option. You're not going to commute 3 hours each way. That company is the sole buyer of labor in this market, and that gives it enormous power over wages. That's monopsony in action. The College Board loves this concept because it flips everything you think you know about competitive markets and minimum wages, and that flip is exactly where exam traps hide. Formally, a monopsony is a market in which there is only one buyer of a resource, typically labor. Just as a monopolist faces the entire market demand curve when selling output, a monopsonist faces the entire market supply curve when buying inputs. The upward sloping supply and the marginal factor cost. Here's where things get interesting, and where you need to think carefully. In a perfectly competitive factor market, a single firm is a wage taker. It can hire as many workers as it wants at the going market wage because the labor supply curve it faces is perfectly elastic horizontal. But the monopsonist faces the entire upward sloping market supply of labor. If it wants to hire more workers, it has to offer a higher wage. And here's the crucial twist. It has to pay that higher wage to all workers, not just the new one. This creates a concept called the marginal factor cost, or MFC, sometimes called marginal resource cost, or MRC. College Board uses both, but MFC is more common in the factor market context, so learn both. The MFC is the additional cost of hiring one more unit of labor, because the monopsonist must raise wages for everyone when it hires more. The MFC rises faster than the wage itself. This means the MFC curve lies above the labor supply curve, always. This is a non-negotiable graph feature you must know cold. Drawing the monopsony graph. Let's walk through the graph you absolutely must be able to draw and label for the FRQ. On the horizontal axis, put quantity of labor, QL. On the vertical axis, put wage cost, W. You'll draw 3 curves. First, the labor supply curve, S, which slopes upward. This also represents the average factor cost, or AFC, because each wage level is the average cost per worker. Second, the MFC curve, which also slopes upward but is steeper than the supply curve and lies above it. Mathematically, it rises at roughly twice the rate of a linear supply curve, just as MR lies below a linear demand curve for a monopolist. Third, the marginal revenue product of labor curve, MRPL, which slopes downward. This is the firm's demand for labor, representing the additional revenue the firm earns from hiring one more worker. Now for the key decision rule. And this is worth burning into memory. The monopsonist hires up to the point where MRPL equals MFC. Drop a vertical line from that intersection down to the horizontal axis. That gives you the quantity of labor hired, which we'll call QM for monopsony. But here's the trap students fall into. The wage the monopsonist pays is not found where MRP meets MFC. Instead, you go from QM straight down to the supply curve, and that wage is your monopsony wage WM. The supply curve tells you what wage workers are willing to accept for that quantity. So you have this telling gap on the graph. The MRP at QM is higher than WM. That gap represents the monopsonist's exploitation. Workers are being paid less than their marginal revenue product. Label this carefully on any FRQ, because scoring rubrics will check for it. Comparing monopsony to competitive outcomes. To find the competitive equilibrium for comparison, look at where MRPL intersects the labor supply curve. That gives you the competitive wage WC and competitive quantity QC. Notice that QC is greater than QM and WC is greater than WM. The monopsonist hires fewer workers and pays them a lower wage than a competitive market would. This is the deadweight loss of monopsony. Resources are being underallocated and society is worse off. You can shade the deadweight loss triangle on your graph. It sits between QM and QC, bounded above by the MRP curve and below by the supply curve. Minimum wages in monopsony, the big exam trap. Here is one of the most famous MCQ and FRQ setups on the entire AP Microexam, and it involves a result that feels completely wrong until you understand the logic. In a competitive labor market, a minimum wage above the equilibrium wage creates unemployment. But in a monopsony, a well-placed minimum wage can actually increase both employment and wages simultaneously. Think about why. When the government sets a minimum wage at or below the competitive wage WOC, it essentially makes the labor supply curve flat, perfectly elastic up to that point. This in turn makes MFC equal to the minimum wage for that range, not the steep MFC curve you had before. If the minimum wage is set exactly at WC, the monopsonist now faces a MFC equal to WC up until QC, which means it will hire QC workers, the competitive quantity at the competitive wage. Minimum wage eliminated the monopsony distortion entirely. This result is the exact opposite of the competitive market story, and the College Board has tested it repeatedly. Don't let your competitive market instincts lead you astray here. Connections to other units. Monopsony connects directly to Unit 4's discussion of market power and deadweight loss. The logic is structurally identical to monopoly, just on the buying side. It also ties back to Unit 5's broader framework of factor markets and MRP, so make sure your MRP analysis from Section 5.2 is solid before tackling this. And the minimum wage discussion loops back to Unit 2's supply and demand thinking, reminding you that price floors behave differently depending on market structure. Quick exam reminders. Always label your graph with S equals AFC, MFC above S, and MRPL sloping down. The hiring rule is MRP equals MFC. The wage is read off the supply curve. The monopsony result is lower wages and lower employment than competitive markets. And minimum wages in monopsony can be beneficial, a complete reversal of the competitive story. With monopsony under your belt, you now have a complete picture of how market power distorts outcomes on both the output and input sides, which sets you up perfectly to think about policies, regulations, and the role of unions in counteracting monopsony power. 5.5 Marginal Revenue Product, MRP, and Derived Demand. The big idea. Why do firms hire anyone at all? Let's start with a deceptively simple question. Why does a coffee shop hire a barista? The answer isn't because they need someone to make drinks. That's circular. The real answer is that the barista's labor generates revenue for the shop, and as long as that revenue exceeds the cost of hiring the barista, the shop makes more profit by hiring them than by not doing so. That logic, hiring a worker because their labor produces value, is the entire engine behind factor markets, and it's exactly what marginal revenue product captures. Here's the core definition you need to have cold. Marginal revenue product, MRP, is the additional revenue a firm earns by hiring one more unit of a factor of production. The formula is deceptively clean. MRP equals marginal product, MP, times marginal revenue, MR. Let's unpack that. Marginal product tells you how much additional output that one extra worker or machine or acre of land produces. Marginal revenue tells you how much extra revenue the firm earns from selling one more unit of output. Multiply them together, and you get what that worker is actually worth to the firm in dollar terms. If a third barista can make 20 extra lattes per hour, and each latte earns the cafe $4 in revenue, that barista's MRP is $20 per hour. Simple, powerful, and directly testable. The hiring decision rule. Now, here's where everything clicks. A profit-maximizing firm will hire workers up to the point where MRP equals the factor price, most often the wage. Think of it like a cost-benefit rule for labor. Keep hiring as long as what the worker brings in, MRP, exceeds what the worker costs, wage. Stop exactly when they're equal, hire one more beyond that, and you're paying more than the worker contributes, instant profit drain. This rule is the labor market twin of the golden P equals MR equals MC rule you learned in product markets. On the AP exam, whenever you see a question asking how many workers a competitive firm should hire, you're looking for the quantity of labor where MRP equals wage. Write that down somewhere memorable. Derived demand and why it matters. Here's a concept that sounds abstract but becomes obvious with one good story. Imagine the housing market is booming. Suddenly, construction companies are desperate to hire carpenters. Why? Not because anyone suddenly loves carpentry, but because demand for houses has increased. The demand for carpenters is derived from the demand for the product they help create. That's derived demand, the demand for a factor of production that arises because of demand for the good or service that factor produces. This concept does serious work on the AP exam. It means that anything that shifts product demand will also shift factor demand. If consumers start loving craft coffee, the demand for baristas rises. If streaming services kill movie theaters, demand for projectionists falls. Factor demand curves shift whenever product demand shifts, input productivity changes, or the prices of related inputs change. These are your three big demand shifters for labor, and the AP exam loves asking about them. Drawing and reading the MRP curve? You absolutely must be able to draw this graph. Here's how it looks. Put the quantity of labor workers hired on the horizontal axis and the wage rate, or factor price, on the vertical axis. The MRP curve slopes downward from left to right. Why? Because of diminishing marginal returns as you add more workers to a fixed amount of capital. Each additional worker adds less and less output than the one before. Smaller MP means smaller MRP, which gives you that downward slope. In a perfectly competitive factor market, the firm is a wage taker, just as it's a price taker in the product market. The wage appears as a flat horizontal line on your graph. The firm can hire as many workers as it wants at the market wage. The optimal quantity of labor is where that flat wage line intersects the downward sloping MRP curve. That intersection is your answer every time. Now here's a critical wrinkle for firms that have market power in the product market. Think monopolists or oligopolists. For these firms, MR is less than price because they must lower price to sell more. That means their MRP equals MP times MR is smaller than it would be for a competitive firm with the same productivity. The MRP curve for a monopolist sits below and to the left of the MRP curve for a competitive firm. The AP exam loves this comparison. A monopolist hires fewer workers than a competitive industry would, even with identical production technology, because the monopolist's MR is suppressed. Common MCQ traps to avoid. The single most dangerous trap on multiple choice questions is confusing marginal revenue product with marginal product or value of marginal product, VMP. The VMP formula is MP times price, and it applies only when the firm is a price taker in the product market, because only then does MR equal price. If the question tells you the firm has market power, use MR in your formula, not the price. Many students reflexively multiply by price and walk right into the trap. A second classic trap, students sometimes think that if MRP is positive, the firm should keep hiring. Wrong. The firm should hire as long as MRP exceeds the wage, not just as long as MRP is positive. A worker with a positive but low MRP might still cost more than they're worth. Third trap, derived demand questions. When the AP asks what happens to the demand for labor if consumer income rises, and it's a normal good, many students stop at product demand rises. You need to take it one step further. Higher product demand raises product price and output, which raises the MRP of each worker, which shifts the entire labor demand curve rightward. Show that chain of reasoning on an FRQ and you'll earn every point. Connecting to the rest of the course. This topic is the bridge between everything you learned in Units 3 and 4 about firms and product markets, and the factor market analysis of Unit 5. The shape of the MRP curve depends directly on diminishing marginal returns, which you studied in production theory. The position of the MRP curve depends on MR, which you calculated differently for perfect competitors versus monopolists. And changes in the MRP curve drive everything you'll see next about labor market equilibrium, wages, and economic rent. If you truly understand MRP, you've got a thread that runs through the entire second half of this course. With the hiring decision and derived demand now firmly in your toolkit, you're ready to zoom out and see how individual firms' decisions aggregate into the broader labor market, which is exactly where we're heading next. 5.6 Marginal Resource Cost, MRC. What is MRC and why does it matter? Imagine you're running a small bakery and you're deciding whether to hire one more employee. The question isn't just how much will this person produce, it's also how much will this person cost me? That second question is exactly what marginal resource cost answers. MRC is the additional cost a firm incurs when it hires one more unit of a resource. Most commonly, one more worker. It's your hiring cost at the margin, and it sits at the heart of every factor market decision a firm makes. The formula is elegantly simple. MRC equals delta total resource cost divided by quantity of resource. In plain English, divide the change in your total labor bill by the change in the number of workers you hired. If hiring a fifth worker raises your weekly wage bill from $4,000 to $4,900, your MRC for that fifth worker is $900. That's the number you compare against the benefit of hiring, which, as you'll remember from Section 5.5, is the marginal revenue product, or MRP. MRC in a perfectly competitive labor market. Here's where it gets beautifully clean. In a perfectly competitive labor market, a firm is a wage taker, just like a perfectly competitive product market firm is a price taker. The market sets the wage, the firm accepts it, and every single worker is hired at exactly that same wage. This means hiring one more worker costs you exactly the market wage every single time. No more, no less. When MRC equals the wage rate, your MRC curve on a graph is a perfectly horizontal line at the market wage, the exact same shape as the supply curve facing that individual firm. Think of it like buying apples at a farmer's market, where the price is always $2 per apple, no matter how many you buy. Your marginal cost per additional apple is always $2. Same logic applies here. To draw this graph correctly on the AP exam, you need two axes. The vertical axis is labeled wages/MRC/MRP. You'll often see all three on the same diagram. And the horizontal axis is labeled quantity of labor, or number of workers. Draw a downward-sloping MRP curve because of diminishing marginal returns. Each additional worker adds less revenue than the last. Then draw a horizontal line at the market wage, which simultaneously represents the labor supply curve facing the firm and the MRC curve. Where MRP intersects MRC is your profit-maximizing quantity of labor. This is the graph College Board will ask you to draw on the FRQ, so make sure it's locked in. The profit-maximizing hiring rule. The decision rule you absolutely must memorize is this. Hire workers as long as MRP greater than or equaled MRC and stop when MRP equals MRC. This is the factor market version of the P equals MC rule you know from product markets. If MRP is $900 and MRC is $700, hire that worker. They generate more revenue than they cost. If MRP drops to $500, but MRC is still $700, stop. That worker costs more than they contribute. The optimal hiring point is where those two values meet. This rule connects directly back to Unit 3 and Unit 4 concepts. Just as a competitive firm maximizes profit by producing where MR equals MC in the product market, it maximizes profit by hiring where MRP equals MRC in the factor market. The logic is identical. You're always asking, does the next unit add more benefit than cost? MRC in a monopsony, the critical edge case. Now here's where the AP exam loves to trap students. In a monopsony, a market where there's only one buyer of labor, the firm is not a wage taker. It faces the entire upward-sloping market labor supply curve, and this creates a crucial, frequently tested wrinkle. To hire one more worker, the monopsonist must raise the wage for all workers, not just the new one. Picture a small mining town where one company is the only employer. If they want to attract a 10th miner, they might need to raise wages from $20 to $22 per hour. But that $22 now gets paid to all 10 workers, not just the new one. That means the marginal resource cost of hiring the 10th worker isn't $22. It's $22 times 10 workers, minus $20 times 9 workers. The total bill goes from $180 to $220, so MRC is $40. The MRC is higher than the wage actually paid to the new worker. This is the single most important graph in this section for the AP exam. In the monopsony diagram, you'll draw three curves. The labor supply curve slopes upward. Label it SL. The MRC curve also slopes upward but lies above the supply curve because MRC exceeds the wage at every quantity beyond one unit. Then draw the downward-sloping MRP curve. The monopsonist hires at the quantity where MRP equals MRC. Read that quantity off the horizontal axis, then drop down to the supply curve, not the MRC curve, to find the wage actually paid. This is where students go wrong constantly. The wage is found on the supply curve, not at the MRC intersection. The result is that a monopsonist hires fewer workers and pays lower wages than would exist in a competitive labor market. That's the deadweight loss of monopsony power. Common MCQ traps to avoid. The exam will try to confuse you in a few specific ways. First, don't mix up MRC with MRP. They sound similar, but MRC is a cost and MRP is a benefit. Always ask yourself, is this the cost of hiring or the revenue from hiring? Second, in the monopsony graph, never read the wage off the MRC curve. The wage is always found on the supply curve at the optimal quantity. Third, watch for questions that ask whether a competitive firm's MRC equals the wage. It does, always, because the supply curve facing a wage taker is horizontal. If a question implies MRC is rising for a competitive firm, that's a trap. Also connect MRC to your broader understanding of market power. A firm with monopsony power in the labor market behaves analogously to a monopolist in the product market. Both restrict quantity below the competitive equilibrium to exploit their market power, one on the buying side, one on the selling side. Putting it all together, MRC is your compass in the factor market. Whether you're a wage-taking competitive firm reading a flat MRC line or a monopsonist navigating a steep MRC curve that rises above wages, the hiring rule never changes. Maximize by setting MRP equal to MRC. Know your graphs cold, know where wages are actually read from, and never confuse the cost of a resource with the revenue it generates. With MRC firmly in your toolkit, you're ready to zoom out and see the full picture, how all these factor market forces combine to determine wages, employment, and income distribution across the entire economy. 5.7 MRP equals MRC hiring rule. The core decision rule. Imagine you're the manager of a pizza restaurant and you're deciding whether to hire one more delivery driver. You ask yourself two questions. How much extra revenue will this driver bring in? And how much will this driver cost me? If the extra revenue exceeds the extra cost, you hire. If it doesn't, you don't. That intuition, elegant in its simplicity, is the entire engine behind the MRP equals MRC hiring rule. And it is one of the most tested concepts in all of AP Microeconomics. Let's build the vocabulary first, because College Board will use these terms precisely, and so should you. Marginal revenue product, or MRP, is the additional revenue a firm earns by hiring one more unit of a resource, in most cases, one more worker. The formula is straightforward. MRP equals marginal product of labor multiplied by marginal revenue, or MRP equals MP multiplied times MR. Meanwhile, marginal resource cost, or MRC, is the additional cost to the firm of hiring one more unit of that resource. In a perfectly competitive labor market, which is the baseline case you'll encounter most often, MRC simply equals the market wage, because the firm can hire as many workers as it wants at the going rate without affecting that wage. The hiring rule itself is this: a profit-maximizing firm should hire additional workers as long as MRP is greater than or equal to MRC, and stop hiring when MRP equals MRC. Hire up to, but not beyond, the point where MRP equals MRC. That equality is the sweet spot, the profit-maximizing quantity of labor. Building the graph. Here's the graph you absolutely must be able to draw for an FRQ. Place quantity of labor on the horizontal axis and dollars on the vertical axis. The MRP curve slopes downward from left to right. This is critical because of the law of diminishing marginal returns. As you add more workers to a fixed amount of capital, each additional worker contributes a little less output than the one before. Since MRP equals MP times MR and MP is falling, MRP must fall too. This downward sloping MRP curve is also the firm's labor demand curve. College Board loves asking you to identify this, so cement it in your mind. In factor markets, a firm's MRP curve is its demand curve for labor. Now draw a horizontal line at the market wage level. In a competitive labor market, this flat line represents the MRC. The firm is a wage taker, just like a perfectly competitive firm in the product market is a price taker. The intersection of the downward sloping MRP curve and the flat MRC line gives you the optimal quantity of labor, which you should label QONs on the horizontal axis. That's the graph. It looks deceptively simple, but the exam will test whether you truly understand each component. Connecting MRP to what you already know. Here's where things get beautifully interconnected. Think back to Unit 3, where you studied profit maximization in product markets using the rule MR equals MC. The MRP equals MRC rule is literally the same logic applied to the factor market. Instead of asking, how much output should I produce? The firm is asking, how many inputs should I hire? The mathematics and reasoning are parallel. You're equating the marginal benefit of an action to its marginal cost, which is the heartbeat of economic thinking throughout this entire course. Also notice the connection to Unit 2 and diminishing returns. The downward slope of MRP isn't arbitrary. It's grounded in the production function. When you studied short-run production, you saw that adding workers eventually yields smaller and smaller gains in output. That same diminishing marginal product is what causes MRP to decline as employment rises. The competitive labor market baseline. In a competitive labor market, because MRC equals the wage, you can rewrite the hiring rule as MRP equals W at the optimal quantity of labor. If the wage rises, say the government raises the minimum wage or labor becomes scarcer, the MRC line shifts up and the firm will hire fewer workers. The new intersection is further to the left. This is why the labor demand curve slopes downward. Higher wages lead to fewer workers hired. If the wage falls, the firm hires more. You should be able to trace through these changes on your graph fluidly. Edge cases and MCQ traps. Now let's talk about the traps, because this is where students lose points. The most common mistake is confusing the product market structure with the labor market structure. Here's the trap. A firm can be a price maker in the product market, a monopoly, while still being a wage taker in the labor market. In that case, MRC still equals the wage, competitive labor market, but MRP is calculated using marginal revenue rather than price, because for a monopolist, MR is less than price. This means a monopolist's MRP curve lies below the value of marginal product curve, VMP equals MP times P. The monopolist hires fewer workers than a competitive firm would, even facing the same wage. College Board has tested this distinction repeatedly. Another trap involves the direction of your reasoning. Some students see that MRP greater than MRC and think the firm should stop hiring, reasoning that if it's getting more than it's paying, it must already be maximizing profit. Wrong. That situation actually means the firm should hire more because each additional worker adds more to revenue than to cost. You only stop when the two are equal. Also, watch out for questions that ask what happens when MRP exceeds MRC at the current employment level. The answer is always hire more workers. When MRC exceeds MRP, the firm is hiring too many workers and should reduce employment. Equilibrium is only at equality. One more edge case worth knowing. If the wage equals the MRP of the very first worker, the firm hires exactly one worker and no more. If the market wage exceeds the MRP at every level of employment, the firm hires 0 workers. These boundary conditions occasionally appear in MCQs, designed to test whether you truly understand the rule rather than just memorizing it. FRQ scoring points. On free response questions, if you're asked to find the profit-maximizing level of employment from a table, calculate MRP for each worker by multiplying MP by MR, then compare each MRP to the wage. Hire all workers whose MRP is greater than or equal to the wage, and stop at the last worker where MRP greater than or equal to wage. Show your calculations explicitly. Graders award points for the process, not just the answer. Mastering the MRP equals MRC rule is your foundation for everything else in Unit 5. And as we move forward, you'll see how the wage-taking assumption gets challenged when we introduce a very different kind of labor market, one where a single employer holds all the power. 5.8 Wage determination in competitive labor markets. Let's talk about how wages actually get set in a world where nobody has special power, where workers are plentiful, employers are plentiful, and everyone is just a price taker doing their best. This is the competitive labor market model, and it is one of the most testable setups in all of AP Microeconomics. Get this one down cold, and you'll find that the harder labor market topics, monopsony, unions, minimum wages, all make a lot more sense because you'll always be comparing them back to this baseline. The big picture. Labor as a market. Here's the core insight you need to carry with you. Labor markets work just like product markets, only flipped. In a product market, firms supply goods and consumers demand them. In a labor market, workers supply their time and firms demand it. Supply and demand still meet at an equilibrium price, except now that price is called a wage, and the quantity traded is the number of workers employed. Every tool you learned back in Unit 1 applies here. That's not a coincidence. The College Board builds the course this way intentionally, so lean into that connection. The labor demand curve, derived demand. Here's where things get interesting. Firms don't hire workers because they enjoy having people around. They hire workers because those workers help produce things that can be sold. This is the concept of derived demand. The demand for labor is derived from the demand for the product labor helps create. If pizza becomes wildly popular, pizza shops hire more workers. If demand for pizza collapses, those workers lose their jobs. The demand for labor literally derives from the demand for the output. Now, how does a firm decide how many workers to hire? The answer is the marginal revenue product of labor, or MRPL. The formula is MRPL equals marginal product of labor times price of output, or equivalently, MRPL equals delta TR divided by delta L. Think of it this way. You hire one more barista. She makes 20 extra lattes per hour. Each latte sells for $5. Her marginal revenue product is $20 multiplied by 5 equals $100 per hour. That's the extra revenue she brings to the cafe. The firm compares that number to her wage. If her MRP is greater than the wage, hiring her adds to profit. If her MRP is less than the wage, hiring her destroys profit. The firm's profit-maximizing hiring rule is to hire workers up to the point where MRPL equals wage, which is also the marginal factor cost, or MFC, in a competitive market. This is your decision rule. Memorize it exactly as the College Board phrases it. Hire until MRPL equals the wage rate. Because of diminishing marginal returns, a concept from Unit 3, see how it connects? Each additional worker adds less to output than the one before. The 15th barista is bumping into the others. The machines are getting crowded. So MRPL falls as employment rises. This gives the labor demand curve its downward slope. The labor supply curve, the worker side. In a competitive labor market, individual workers take the wages given, just as firms take product prices as given in perfect competition. The market labor supply curve slopes upward because higher wages attract more workers into this labor market, either from other industries or from leisure. At the firm level, however, the individual firm faces a perfectly elastic horizontal labor supply curve at the going market wage. This is critical. If a firm tries to pay below the market wage, no worker comes. If it pays the market wage, it can hire as many workers as it wants. This is exactly analogous to the perfectly competitive firm facing a horizontal demand curve for its product. Drawing the graphs. Do this until it's automatic. For the AP exam, you need to be able to draw two graphs simultaneously, the market labor market graph and the individual firm's labor market graph. Think of it like the industry versus firm setup in perfect competition from Unit 3. On the market graph, draw a downward sloping market labor demand curve, DL, and an upward sloping market labor supply curve, SL. Where they intersect, label the equilibrium wage W and equilibrium quantity of labor Q. Both axes must be labeled. The horizontal axis is quantity of labor workers, and the vertical axis is wage rate, worker. On the firm's graph, draw a horizontal line at W's. This is simultaneously the firm's labor supply curve, its average factor cost curve, AFC, and its marginal factor cost curve, MFC. They're all the same thing in a competitive market because each worker costs the same wage. Then draw the firm's downward sloping MRPL curve. Where MRPL intersects the wage line, that's the firm's optimal employment level. Label it Q firm. This intersection point, MRPL equals MFC equals WA*ST, is the heart of the whole model. Shifts in labor demand and supply. Labor demand shifts when anything changes the MRPL. An increase in product demand raises output prices, which raises MRPL and shifts labor demand right. More workers hired at every wage. A technological improvement that raises worker productivity also shifts labor demand right. Conversely, automation that replaces workers shifts labor demand left. Labor supply shifts when the number of available workers changes, immigration increases. Labor supply, an aging population decreases it. Changes in the wages of related occupations also shift supply. If truck drivers suddenly earn much more, some workers will leave other industries and supply will shift left in those markets. Common exam traps to avoid. The most common MCQ trap is confusing the firm's horizontal supply curve with the market's upward sloping supply curve. They look different on purpose. Don't mix them up. A second trap, students sometimes forget that MRPL already accounts for diminishing returns, so you don't need to adjust for it separately. Third, watch out for questions that change the product price and ask how wages are affected. Remember, higher product prices raise MRPL, which increases labor demand, pushing wages up. That chain of reasoning is frequently tested on FRQs. Finally, be precise about the equilibrium condition. It's MRPL equals W, not MRPL equals MFC separately. In competition, they're the same. But on FRQs, writing both earns you full credit. Connections across the course. This topic is a bridge. Looking backward, it draws on diminishing marginal returns from Unit 3 and market equilibrium from Unit 1. Looking forward, it becomes your baseline for comparing against the monopsony model in Section 5.9. Every feature of monopsony is a distortion away from this competitive ideal. Minimum wage policy, often tested in FRQs, is analyzed as a price floor in this labor market graph, which connects straight back to Unit 1 price controls. With your competitive baseline firmly in place, let's walk into the world where one employer holds all the power, the monopsony model, where things get decidedly less fair for workers. 5.9 Shifts in labor demand and labor supply. Let's talk about what actually moves the curves in a labor market, because on the AP exam, you won't just be asked to identify where the equilibrium is. You'll be asked what happens to wages and employment when conditions in the economy change. That's the heart of this section, and honestly, once you see the logic, it becomes almost intuitive. The big picture first. Remember from the last few sections that the labor market has a downward-sloping demand curve and an upward-sloping supply curve, intersecting at an equilibrium wage and quantity of labor. When something shifts one of those curves, not a change in wages themselves, but a change in an underlying condition, the equilibrium moves. Your job on the exam is to identify which curve shifts, in which direction, and what that does to the equilibrium wage and employment level. Let's walk through each side carefully. Shifts in labor demand. Labor demand comes from firms, and recall that the key concept driving it is the marginal revenue product of labor, or MRPL. That's the formula you need tattooed in your brain. MRPL equals MRCL, which tells the firm how many workers to hire, but the demand curve itself shifts when MRPL changes at every quantity of labor. So what causes that? The first and most important shifter is a change in the price of the output the workers produce. Think about craft breweries. If the price of craft beer rises, maybe hops become trendy, who knows, then each worker at the brewery is generating more revenue for every barrel they help produce. Their MRPL goes up at every level of employment. The entire labor demand curve shifts, right? Wages rise and employment increases. Flip it around. If the price of the product falls, MRPL falls at every level, demand shifts left, wages and employment both fall. This is the most commonly tested shifter on the AP exam, and it connects beautifully back to Unit 3 and 4 content on product market changes. The second big shifter is a change in worker productivity. If technology improves, say workers now use better software, better machinery, better training, they produce more output per hour, which means their MRPL rises even without any change in output price. Again, demand shifts right. This is why investment in capital and technology matters so much economically. It doesn't just help firms, it actually raises wages in a functioning labor market. The AP exam loves this connection. Third, watch out for changes in the number of firms in the industry, which is really just a market-level effect. More firms means more demand for workers at every wage level. That's a rightward shift in market labor demand. This one is intuitive and appears frequently in scenario-based MCQs. Here's a classic MCQ trap. Students confuse a change in wages with a shift in labor demand. If wages rise because supply decreases, you do not say labor demand shifted. You say firms move up along the existing demand curve. Only external shocks to MRPL shift the demand curve itself. Don't mix up movement along a curve with a shift of the curve. That's an easy point to lose. Shifts in labor supply. Now let's move to the supply side, which represents workers. The labor supply curve shifts when something changes workers' willingness and ability to offer their services at any given wage, and when the number of available workers changes. The most straightforward shifter is a change in the size of the labor force. Immigration that brings working-age people into an economy shifts labor supply, right? More workers available at every wage level, which pushes equilibrium wages down and employment up. An aging population retiring shifts supply left, reducing the quantity of labor available, pushing wages up. You'll see this framing appear in FRQ prompts about demographic changes, and you need to draw it correctly. The supply curve moves left, the equilibrium point slides up the demand curve to a higher wage and lower employment quantity. Another major shifter is a change in workers' preferences or non-wage alternatives. If unemployment benefits become more generous, some workers may become more selective about which jobs they accept, effectively reducing labor supply at each wage, shifting the curve left. Alternatively, if working conditions in an industry become more attractive, better safety, remote flexibility, prestige, more people become willing to work in that sector, shifting supply right? Think of how the tech industry's culture and perks drew workers away from other sectors for decades. Related to preferences is the concept of opportunity cost. If wages in a competing industry or occupation rise dramatically, workers may migrate there, pulling supply out of your industry. This is especially important when thinking about occupational labor markets rather than the whole economy. Finally, changes in education and training affect both demand and supply. And this is where students often get confused. Better worker education increases productivity, which shifts labor demand right, but an increase in the number of trained workers available shifts labor supply right. These are two different mechanisms producing two different shifts. Nail that distinction for the FRQ. Drawing and interpreting the graph. For any AP exam graph on this topic, you need a clean labor market diagram. The horizontal axis is labeled quantity of labor, Q_L. The vertical axis is the wage rate, W. Draw a downward-sloping demand curve labeled DL and an upward-sloping supply curve labeled SL. Mark the initial equilibrium with a point and label it W1 and Q_1. When a shift occurs, draw the new curve as a dashed line, label it DL2 or SL2, and identify the new intersection as W2 and Q2. Then narrate clearly the curve shifted right or left, causing the wage to rise or fall and employment to rise or fall. The AP rubric awards points for accurate labeling, correct direction of shift, and correct identification of the new equilibrium. Missing any label or drawing ambiguous intersections costs you points. Connections to other units and common exam patterns. This topic connects directly to Unit 2's supply and demand framework. Same logic, different market. It connects to Unit 4 on imperfect competition because in a monopsony, the firm affects wages directly. And understanding what shifts demand and supply helps you analyze how monopsony wages change. And it connects to Unit 5's discussion of MRPL, which you've already worked through. On FRQs, the College Board frequently presents a scenario, a new technology, a change in immigration policy, a shift in consumer demand, and asks you to show the effect on the labor market and the resulting changes in wages and employment. Your job is systematic. Identify which market is affected. Identify which curve shifts and why, draw it correctly, and state the directional effects precisely. One last trap to avoid. When both curves shift simultaneously, be careful about what you can say with certainty. If demand rises and supply rises at the same time, employment definitely increases, but the wage effect is ambiguous. It depends on which shift is larger. The AP exam will sometimes set up these ambiguous cases intentionally, and the correct answer is to say the wage effect is indeterminate. Never guess a direction when the logic doesn't support it. With a firm grasp of what moves labor demand and supply, you're perfectly set up to explore what happens when markets don't reach their natural equilibrium, which takes us right into our next topic on minimum wages, monopsony, and market interventions in factor markets. 5.10 Monopsony in labor markets. What is a monopsony, and why should you care? Imagine you live in a small town with exactly one hospital. You're a nurse. You need a job. Where are you going to work? That's right, the hospital. They know it, and you know it. That single employer has enormous power over the wages they pay you because you have almost nowhere else to go. That situation, one buyer in a labor market, is called a monopsony, and it's the mirror image of the monopoly you already studied in product markets. Just as a monopolist is the only seller of a good, a monopsonist is the only buyer of labor. And just like a monopolist distorts the output market, a monopsonist distorts the labor market in ways that hurt workers and create deadweight loss. The College Board loves monopsony because it tests whether you truly understand factor markets, not just product markets. So let's build this concept from the ground up. The monopsonist's unique problem: upward-sloping labor supply. In a competitive labor market, a firm is a wage taker. It can hire as many workers as it wants at the market wage without affecting that wage. The supply of labor to that firm is perfectly elastic, a flat horizontal line. But the monopsonist faces the entire market labor supply curve, which slopes upward. Why? Because to attract each additional worker, the monopsonist has to offer a higher wage, not just to the new worker, but to all previously hired workers as well. This is the key insight. And it's also where the math gets interesting, because raising the wage for one more worker means raising wages for everyone already employed. the cost of hiring an additional worker is always higher than just that worker's wage. This extra cost has a name: the marginal factor cost of labor, or MFCL, sometimes called marginal resource cost, or MRC. The MFCL curve lies above the labor supply curve, just like a monopolist's marginal revenue curve lies below its demand curve. That parallel structure is not a coincidence. It's the same logic flipped to the buying side of a market. Drawing the monopsony graph, your exam blueprint. Here's how you build the graph that will earn you full credit on the FRQ. Draw a standard labor market graph with the quantity of labor on the horizontal axis and wages costs on the vertical axis. You need 4 curves. First, draw an upward sloping supply of labor, SL, curve. This represents the wages the firm must pay to attract each quantity of workers. Second, draw the marginal factor cost of labor, MFCL curve, which is also upward sloping but lies entirely above the supply curve and rises more steeply because of that wage raising for everyone effect. Third, draw a downward sloping marginal revenue product of labor, MRPL curve. This is the demand for labor, equal to marginal product times output price, exactly as you learned earlier in Unit 5. Fourth, the MRPL curve serves as the firm's demand for labor. Now for the decision rule. The monopsonist maximizes profit by hiring where MRPL equals MFCL. Find that intersection. Drop a vertical line straight down to the horizontal axis. That quantity is Q mono, the quantity of workers hired. Here's the trap students fall into constantly. The wage the monopsonist pays is not found at the MFCL curve. Instead, you travel from Q mono horizontally to the supply curve, then read across to the vertical axis. That wage, call it W mono, is what workers actually receive. Because MFCL is above supply, W mono is lower than the competitive wage, and Q mono is lower than the competitive quantity of workers hired. Label your competitive equilibrium too. That's where MRPL intersects SL, giving you AHF comp and Q comp, both higher than their monopsony counterparts. The deadweight loss triangle sits between Q mono and Q comp, bounded above by MRPL and below by SL. This triangle represents the mutually beneficial transactions that never happen because the monopsonist restricts hiring to push wages down. The formula recap and calculation method. If you see numbers on the AP exam, here's your process. First, identify the wage function from the labor supply, something like W equals 2L plus 10, meaning each additional worker hired raises the wage. To find MFCL, you can use the fact that total factor cost equals W times L. So TFC equals 2L plus 10L equals 2L squared plus 10L. Take the derivative, or on the AP exam, recognize that for a linear supply curve, W equals a plus BL, the MFC equals a plus 2BL. The MFC has the same intercept but twice the slope of the supply curve. Set MFC L equal to MRPL, solve for L, then substitute that L back into the supply equation to find the wage. Never substitute L back into MFC. That gives you cost, not the wage paid. Monopsony versus competition, the key comparisons. Compared to a competitive labor market, a monopsony produces 3 outcomes you must memorize. Workers are paid a lower wage, fewer workers are hired, and the firm captures a greater surplus. Workers' surplus is reduced, deadweight loss exists, and resources are allocated inefficiently. This is directly analogous to how a monopolist charges higher prices, produces less output, and creates deadweight loss in a product market. Minimum wage as a policy response, an edge case that loves to appear on the MCQ. Here's a subtle concept that trips up even well-prepared students. In a competitive labor market, a minimum wage above equilibrium causes unemployment. You learned that in earlier units. But in a monopsony, a minimum wage set between W mono and W comp can actually increase both wages and employment simultaneously. Why? Because the minimum wage flattens the supply curve below that floor, making the effective MFCL equal to the minimum wage up until supply intersects the minimum wage. This removes the monopsonist's incentive to restrict hiring. It's one of the few cases where a price floor doesn't create a surplus. It corrects an inefficiency. If you see a question asking about the effect of a minimum wage in a monopsony, don't default to the competitive market answer. Connections to the rest of the course. Monopsony connects backward to your Unit 5 work on MRPL and competitive labor markets. You need that foundation to understand why MRPL is the demand curve here. It also connects to Unit 4 monopoly concepts since the mathematical structure is identical. On a deeper level, monopsony is an example of market failure, linking to efficiency arguments you encountered in Unit 1 and Unit 2 when studying consumer and producer surplus. The College Board often pairs monopsony with product market power in FRQs, asking you to trace how a monopolist producer who is also a monopsonist employer compounds inefficiency on both sides. One last warning before you move on. The number one MCQ trap is confusing where to read the wage from. Always read the wage off the supply curve at the profit-maximizing quantity, never off the MFCL curve. The MFCL tells you where to stop hiring. The supply curve tells you what you actually pay. With monopsony under your belt, you're now ready to zoom out and consider how factor market structures, both competitive and otherwise, interact with broader questions of income distribution and inequality across the entire economy. 5.11 minimum wage and its effects in labor markets. Let's talk about one of the most politically charged topics in all of economics, and one that the College Board absolutely loves to test: the minimum wage. You've probably heard arguments about it on the news, maybe even had a debate about it in class. But here's the thing. The AP exam doesn't care about your political opinion. It cares whether you can draw the graph, read the shifts, and explain the effects with precision. So let's build that skill right now. The course setup: minimum wage as a price floor. At its heart, a minimum wage is a price floor in the labor market. Remember from Unit 2 that a price floor is a government-imposed minimum price set above the equilibrium price. If it's set below equilibrium, it's non-binding and has no real effect. That's your first critical edge case. If the minimum wage is $7.25, but the market wage is already $12, the minimum wage is irrelevant. The market clears on its own. Every time you see a minimum wage question on the MCQ, your first mental check should be, is this binding or not? When the minimum wage is set above the equilibrium wage, things get interesting. Now you have a binding price floor, and the labor market is in disequilibrium. Here's how to draw that graph, and you absolutely must be able to draw this from memory on the FRQ. Drawing the graph. Start with your standard competitive labor market. Put the wage rate on the vertical axis and the quantity of labor, usually measured in workers or hours, on the horizontal axis. Draw a downward-sloping labor demand curve because as wages rise, firms want to hire fewer workers. Draw an upward-sloping labor supply curve because as wages rise, more workers want to work. These two curves intersect at your equilibrium wage, call it W star, and equilibrium quantity of labor, call it Q star. So far, so familiar. Now draw a horizontal dashed line above W star, label it W min, the minimum wage. At this new higher wage, follow across to your labor supply curve and mark that point. More workers want jobs now because the wage is higher. Call this quantity QS, quantity supplied of labor. Then follow that same horizontal line to your labor demand curve and mark that point. Fewer firms want to hire at this higher wage. Call this QD, quantity demanded of labor. Notice that QS is greater than QD. The gap between them, that horizontal distance from QD to QS, represents the surplus of labor, which we call unemployment. This is the key result you need to internalize. A binding minimum wage creates a labor surplus or unemployment. Who wins, who loses, and what happens to employment? Here's where students get tripped up on the MCQ, and this is a classic trap. The minimum wage raises the wage for workers who keep their jobs, but it also means fewer workers are employed overall. So labor income can go up or down depending on whether the demand for labor is elastic or inelastic. If demand is inelastic, total wage income, wage times quantity of workers employed, actually rises because the percentage increase in the wage is larger than the percentage decrease in employment. If demand is elastic, total wage income falls. This connects directly back to your Unit 2 elasticity content. See how everything in AP Micro is interconnected? The workers who lose their jobs are worse off. The workers who keep their jobs and receive the higher wage are better off. And firms are paying higher wages for fewer workers. Their labor costs per unit rise, which often gets passed to consumers in the form of higher prices. That connects to Unit 3, where we talk about how cost increases shift supply curves leftward and raise market prices. Surplus of labor. Breaking it down further, the unemployment created by the minimum wage has two components, and knowing this can earn you serious FRQ points. First, there's the reduction in the quantity of labor demanded firms. Fire some workers or don't hire new ones. Second, there's the increase in the quantity of labor supplied. More people enter the labor force chasing that higher wage. The total surplus equals the increase in quantity supplied plus the decrease in quantity demanded. That total gap is the unemployment effect. If a question asks you to identify the source of unemployment, make sure you account for both sides of the market supply expanding and demand contracting. The efficiency cost, deadweight loss. Just like a price ceiling creates deadweight loss in a product market, a binding minimum wage creates deadweight loss in the labor market. The transactions that would have occurred, the workers who would have been employed at wages between W star and W min, no longer happen. Mutually beneficial exchanges are killed off. On your graph, this deadweight loss is the triangle between the demand and supply curves, to the left of QD and below QS, bounded at the original equilibrium. Think of it as the value of the economic activity that just evaporates. The monopsony exception. Know this cold. Here's an edge case that appears on both MCQs and FRQs and confuses a lot of students. In a monopsony labor market where there is only one buyer of labor, the minimum wage can actually increase employment, not decrease it. This seems paradoxical, but remember that a monopsonist is already hiring fewer workers than the competitive equilibrium because it has wage-setting power and pushes wages below the competitive level. A minimum wage that is set between the monopsonist's preferred wage and the competitive equilibrium wage can actually move the outcome closer to efficiency. This is the one situation where a price floor in the labor market can improve market outcomes rather than worsen them. The College Board has tested this explicitly, so don't let it catch you off guard. Common MCQ traps to avoid. Watch out for questions that ask about the effect of a minimum wage increase on a specific group, like teenagers or low-skilled workers. These groups typically face more elastic labor demand, so the unemployment effects are proportionally larger for them. Also watch for questions that confuse employment, the number of workers hired, with the wage rate. A minimum wage always raises the wage for employed workers, but it never guarantees more workers are employed, unless you're in the monopsony case. And one more trap. Don't confuse a minimum wage with a wage subsidy like the Earned Income Tax Credit. A wage subsidy shifts the demand or supply curve. A minimum wage is a price floor. They both aim to help low-wage workers but operate through entirely different mechanisms. Connections to other units. Minimum wage sits at the intersection of several AP microthreads. It's a price floor, Unit 2. It involves elasticity analysis, Unit 2. It affects firm costs and product pricing, Unit 3. And it connects to factor market theory and derived demand, Unit 5. When the FRQ asks you to explain the effect of a minimum wage increase on a competitive product market, they want you to trace the chain. Higher wages mean higher production costs. Supply in the product market shifts left. Price rises. Quantity falls. That's a full multi-part answer waiting to happen. With minimum wage firmly in your toolkit, you're ready to explore how these labor market distortions interact with other factor market regulations. So let's turn next to how economists think about income inequality and the broader distribution of wages across different types of workers. 5.12 Economic Rent and Transfer Earnings. What are we really talking about? Let's start with a question that sounds simple but trips up a lot of students. When an economist says rent, do they mean what you pay your landlord every month? Not exactly, and that confusion is one of the most common traps on the AP exam. So let's clear this up right now, because once you understand the distinction, everything in this section clicks into place. Economic rent and transfer earnings are two components that together make up the total payment a factor of production receives. Think of it like slicing a paycheck. Every worker, every piece of land, every unit of capital gets paid something. That payment can be split into two parts: the portion the factor had to receive to stay in its current use, and the portion above that minimum. That minimum required payment is called transfer earnings. The surplus above that minimum is called economic rent. Here's an analogy. Imagine your friend is a graphic designer who would quit her job and go work at a coffee shop if she earned anything less than $40,000 a year. That $40,000 is her transfer earnings. It's the wage needed to keep her transferred into her current occupation rather than her next best alternative. Now say she actually earns $65,000. That extra $25,000, pure economic rent. It's a bonus above what was necessary to keep her right where she is. The key formula you need to have locked in is this: total factor payment equals transfer earnings plus economic rent and flipping it. And flipping it, economic rent equals total factor payment minus transfer earnings. These aren't complicated equations, but the AP exam will test whether you can identify each component correctly in a scenario. The graph you must know cold. Now, let's talk about the graph, because the AP exam absolutely loves asking you to draw and interpret this one. Picture a standard labor market diagram. Wage on the vertical axis, quantity of labor on the horizontal axis. You have a downward sloping labor demand curve and an upward sloping labor supply curve. They intersect at the equilibrium wage. Here's the critical visual. The area between the equilibrium wage and the labor supply curve, that triangular region above the supply curve and below the equilibrium wage line, represents economic rent for all workers combined. The area under the supply curve up to the equilibrium quantity represents transfer earnings. Together, those two areas fill the entire rectangle of total factor income paid to labor. Why does the supply curve represent transfer earnings? Because the supply curve shows the minimum wage each successive worker requires to enter this market. The very first worker might be willing to work for nearly nothing. Maybe they love the job. The last worker hired right at equilibrium needs to be paid exactly the going market wage to be enticed in. Every worker below that last one is receiving more than their minimum, and that surplus is economic rent for each of them. Now, here's an edge case that the MCQ writers love. What happens when labor supply is perfectly inelastic? A vertical line? In that case, the entire factor payment is economic rent, and transfer earnings drop to zero. Think of a sports superstar. LeBron James has an extraordinary, irreplaceable talent. He would almost certainly still be a basketball player, even if the NBA paid him a fraction of what he earns. The supply of LeBron James is essentially fixed. You can't produce more of him. So nearly all of his income is economic rent. The AP exam might give you a vertical supply curve and ask you to identify transfer earnings. The answer is zero. The opposite case, perfectly elastic supply, a horizontal supply curve. Here, economic rent is zero, and the entire payment is transfer earnings. This applies to factors that are abundantly available at a going market price. If you can hire unlimited workers of a certain type all at the same wage, none of them receives a surplus above their minimum requirement. Why economic rent matters and where students go wrong. One of the biggest misconceptions is thinking economic rent only applies to land. It doesn't. The concept applies to any factor of production, labor, land, or capital, whenever that factor earns above its opportunity cost. The word rent here is purely economic jargon, not a real estate term. College Board uses the phrase economic rent, specifically to distinguish it from ordinary rental payments, so make sure your FRQ answers use that precise language. Another trap. Students sometimes think a higher wage always means more economic rent. Not necessarily. If the higher wage is precisely what was needed to attract that worker away from their next best alternative, it's all transfer earnings. Economic rent is specifically the surplus above opportunity cost, not just any income above zero. Connecting to the rest of the course. This topic doesn't exist in isolation. It connects beautifully to several other parts of Unit 5 and beyond. When you studied how wages are determined in competitive and monopsonistic labor markets back in sections 5.1 through 5.4, you were essentially learning what sets the total factor payment. Now in 5.12, you're learning how to decompose that payment. The elasticity of supply, which you covered in Unit 2, directly determines the split between rent and transfer earnings. Lower elasticity means more economic rent. Higher elasticity means more transfer earnings. There's also a connection to Unit 2's producer surplus concept. Economic rent is essentially the factor market analog of producer surplus in the goods market. Just as producer surplus is the area above the supply curve and below the price in a product market, economic rent is the area above the factor supply curve and below the factor price in a factor market. If that parallel is sitting in your notes, you'll be able to reconstruct this concept even if your memory blanks on exam day. For FRQ purposes, if a question asks you to show economic rent on a graph, shade the triangular area above the supply curve and below the equilibrium wage. If it asks you to explain what would happen to economic rent if demand for this factor increased, your answer is demand shifts right. Equilibrium wage rises, the triangle grows larger, so economic rent increases. Walk through that logic step by step, and you'll earn every point on the rubric. One last thing to remember, transfer earnings equal opportunity cost. If you see a question phrased around the minimum payment needed to keep a factor in its current use, that's transfer earnings. They're the same concept wearing different clothing. With economic rent and transfer earnings squared away, you now have a complete picture of how factor markets work, from how wages, rents, and interest are determined, all the way down to what each component of a payment actually means economically, which sets you up perfectly as we move into market failures and the role of government in Unit 6. 5.13 Least Cost, Cost Minimizing Input Combination Rule. The core question: how do firms hire smarter, not just more? Imagine you're running a small pizza shop and you have $100 left in your weekly budget to increase production. You could spend it hiring another delivery driver, or you could spend it on a faster oven. Both cost the same, but which one actually gets you more pizzas out the door? That, in a nutshell, is the question at the heart of the least cost rule. It's not just about how much you spend on inputs. It's about how wisely you allocate each dollar across the inputs you use. And for the AP exam, this concept is one of those beautiful, elegant rules that ties Unit 5's factor markets directly back to everything you learned about production and costs in Unit 3. The rule itself: marginal product per dollar. The least cost rule, also called the cost-minimizing input combination rule, tells a firm how to allocate its budget across multiple inputs, typically labor and capital, in order to produce a given level of output at the lowest possible cost. The rule states that a firm minimizes costs when the last dollar spent on each input yields the same marginal product. Written as a formula, you need this tattooed on your brain going into exam day. MP of labor, price of labor equals MP of capital / price of capital, or using standard notation. MPLW equals MPKWR, where W is the wage rate, the price of labor, and R is the rental rate, the price of capital. Each side of this equation represents the marginal product per dollar spent on that input, sometimes called the bang per buck. When these ratios are equal, you have found the sweet spot. You cannot reshuffle a single dollar from one input to the other and get more output. You are, as economists say, in equilibrium. Think of it like a smoothie budget. Suppose you have $10 and you're buying strawberries and bananas. If each additional strawberry gives you more smoothie satisfaction per dollar than each additional banana, you should keep buying strawberries until the bang per buck evens out. The moment one ingredient gives you more per dollar than the other, you're leaving value on the table. What happens when the rule is violated? This is where the exam will really test you, and it's where most students trip up. If MPL/W greater than MPK/R, that means labor is giving you more output per dollar than capital is. In that case, the firm should hire more labor and use less capital. As the firm adds more labor, the law of diminishing marginal returns kicks in, MPL falls. As the firm reduces capital, MPK rises. The firm keeps adjusting until the two ratios equalize again. The logic runs exactly in reverse when capital has the higher ratio. Shift spending toward capital, away from labor, until equilibrium is restored. Here's the trap the AP exam loves to spring on you. Students often confuse hire more of the cheaper input with hire more of the input with the higher marginal product. Both statements are incomplete on their own. What matters is the ratio, marginal product relative to price. A worker who produces 20 units and earns $10 per hour has a ratio of 2. A machine that produces 30 units and costs $20 per hour has a ratio of 1.5. Even though the machine is more productive in absolute terms, the firm should shift spending toward labor because labor delivers more output per dollar spent. Connecting to isoquants and isocost lines. If your teacher has covered the graphical treatment, know this for the exam. The least cost rule corresponds to the point where an isoquant is tangent to an isocost line. An isoquant is a curve showing all combinations of labor and capital that produce the same quantity of output, like a production contour line. An isocost line shows all combinations of labor and capital a firm can buy for a fixed total expenditure, and its slope is So the formula and the graph are telling you the same thing in two different languages, and being fluent in both will serve you on FRQs, where College Board may ask you to draw and label this diagram. To draw it correctly, put labor on the horizontal axis and capital on the vertical axis. Draw a downward sloping, convex isoquant bowed toward the origin. Draw the isocost line as a straight downward sloping line. The cost minimizing point is where the isocost is just tangent to the isoquant, not crossing through it. If you draw the isocost cutting through the isoquant at 2 points, that depicts an inefficient combination, not the optimum. edge cases, and FRQ precision. 2. Edge cases show up on multiple choice more than you'd expect. First, what if one input's price changes? Say wages rise, the isocost line rotates, becoming steeper, and the old tangency point is no longer optimal. The firm will substitute toward capital. This directly connects to the concept of derived demand from earlier in Unit 5. Changes in input prices alter the optimal input combination. Second, what if marginal products are equal but prices differ? Then the ratios are not equal, so the firm is not minimizing cost, a common MCQ distractor that tries to trick you into thinking equal MPs mean cost minimization. For FRQ scoring, College Board wants to see the formula written correctly, a clear explanation of which direction the firm adjusts, and a statement that the adjustment continues until the ratios equalize. Saying hire more labor without explaining why or until when will cost you points. The bigger picture. The least cost rule is the factor market cousin of the utility maximizing rule from Unit 1, where consumers maximize satisfaction when MUX divided by PX equals MUY divided PY structs. The structural logic is identical. You're always asking, am I getting the most bang for my buck? That parallel is not a coincidence, and recognizing it will help you answer unfamiliar questions by analogy. It also connects forward to the profit maximizing input rule, MRC MRP equals MRC, because producing efficiently is a prerequisite for maximizing profit. With cost minimization now locked in, you're perfectly positioned to explore how firms decide not just how to produce a given output, but how much to produce. And that brings us to the profit maximizing condition in factor markets. 5.14 Graphing factor markets, competitive versus monopsony diagrams. Setting the stage 2, very different hiring worlds. Imagine you're a nurse looking for work in a small rural town. There's exactly one hospital in the county. That hospital knows it's the only game in town, and so do you. Now contrast that with a nurse in Chicago where dozens of hospitals, clinics, and healthcare systems are all competing to hire qualified staff. Those two nurses are living in completely different economic realities, and that contrast is the heart of what this section is all about. You need to be able to draw, label, and interpret both the competitive factor market diagram and the monopsony diagram. And you need to know exactly how outcomes differ between them. Let's build each one carefully. The competitive factor market diagram. In a competitive labor market, many firms are hiring and many workers are available, so no single employer has the power to influence the wage rate. Think of it like a perfectly competitive product market, but flip to the input side of the economy. Here, the market-level diagram shows a downward-sloping labor demand curve and an upward-sloping labor supply curve intersecting to determine the equilibrium wage and employment level. Label the horizontal axis, quantity of labor, measured in workers or hours, and the vertical axis, wage rate. The intersection of supply and demand gives you the competitive equilibrium wage, which you should label W competitive, and the equilibrium quantity of labor labeled L competitive. This is your market diagram. Now here's something students frequently mix up. The individual firm in a competitive labor market is a wage taker, exactly like a price taker in a competitive product market. The individual firm's diagram shows a perfectly horizontal labor supply curve at the market wage, because if the firm tried to pay even 1 cent less, workers would simply go elsewhere. For the individual firm, the wage equals the marginal resource cost, often written as MRC. Since every additional worker costs the same wage, MRC equals the wage equals the labor supply curve. All three are the same horizontal line. The firm then hires where MRC equals MRP, marginal revenue product, which gives you the profit maximizing quantity of labor. Always label this intersection clearly because FRQ graders are looking for it. The formula anchoring this entire unit is MRP equals MR times MP, or equivalently, price times marginal product when the firm is a price taker in the product market. That MRP curve slopes downward because of diminishing marginal returns. Each additional worker adds less to output than the one before. When you draw the firm-level diagram, you have a downward-sloping MRP curve and a horizontal MRC line, and the quantity hired is determined by where MRC equals MRP. Simple, clean, and absolutely essential to have memorized. The monopsony diagram, where things get interesting. Now let's walk into that small-town hospital scenario. A monopsony is a market where there is a single buyer of a resource, one employer in a labor market. This is the mirror image of monopoly in product markets, and that parallel is enormously helpful for keeping your thinking organized. Just as a monopolist faces the entire downward-sloping market demand curve and must lower its price to sell more, a monopsonist faces the entire upward-sloping market supply curve and must raise the wage to attract more workers. Here's where the critical technical detail lives. Because the monopsonist must raise the wage for all workers, not just the new hire. When it wants to attract one more worker, the marginal resource cost curve lies above the labor supply curve. This is the single most important structural feature of the monopsony diagram, and it's also the number one source of confusion on the exam. Let me say it again clearly. MRC is above the supply curve in a monopsony, and the gap between them grows as you move to the right. To draw this diagram correctly, place quantity of labor on the horizontal axis and wage rate on the vertical axis. Draw the upward-sloping labor supply curve, then draw the MRC curve, starting from the same intercept on the vertical axis, but rising more steeply. The MRC curve is essentially double the slope of the supply curve when supply is linear. Then draw the downward-sloping MRP curve, which also represents labor demand. Now here's the key sequence for finding the monopsony equilibrium. First, find where MRC equals MRP. That intersection determines the profit-maximizing quantity of labor the monopsonist will hire, labeled L monopsony. Second, go straight down from that intersection to the supply curve, not to MRC, to find the wage the monopsonist actually pays, labeled W monopsony. This two-step process trips up so many students because they accidentally rid the wage off the MRC curve instead of the supply curve. The supply curve tells you the minimum wage necessary to attract L monopsony workers. The monopsonist pays that minimum, not more. When you compare the two diagrams side by side, the result is stark. The monopsonist hires fewer workers and pays a lower wage than would prevail in a competitive market. Both employment and wages are suppressed. This outcome mirrors how a monopolist restricts output and raises price. The monopsonist restricts employment and lowers the wage below the competitive level. There's also a deadweight loss in the monopsony diagram, represented by the triangle between the MRP curve and the supply curve, bounded between L monopsony and L competitive. This deadweight loss represents the mutually beneficial transactions that don't happen because the monopsonist restricts hiring. Traps, edge cases, and connections. The exam loves to test whether you can identify the correct wage in the monopsony diagram, so practice that two-step process. MRC equals MRP to find quantity, then drop to supply for wage until it's automatic. Another common trap involves minimum wage policy in a monopsony context, which connects back to Unit 2 concepts. In a competitive labor market, a minimum wage above the equilibrium reduces employment. But in a monopsony, a well-set minimum wage can actually increase both wages and employment simultaneously, because it effectively converts the MRC curve into a horizontal line at the minimum wage up to the point where supply exceeds it. This is a classic MCQ scenario that rewards students who understand the diagram deeply rather than just memorizing rules. You should also connect this topic to imperfect competition in product markets from Unit 3. A firm with monopoly power in its product market will have a lower MRP curve than a competitive firm would, because MR is less than price, so that MRP equals MR times MP will yield a lower MRP for any given quantity of labor. This means both market power in product markets and monopsony power in factor markets independently push wages and employment downward, and a firm can have both simultaneously. With your competitive and monopsony diagrams fully mastered, you're perfectly positioned to tackle the broader implications of factor market efficiency and government intervention, which is exactly where we're headed next. 5.15 Bilateral Monopoly in Labor Markets. What happens when two monopolies meet? Imagine you're watching a boxing match, but instead of two fighters, you've got two enormous institutions squaring off over wages. In one corner, you have a monopsonist, a single buyer of labor like the only major employer in a small town. In the other corner, you have a monopoly union, a single seller of labor that controls the supply side of the market. This face-off is what economists call a bilateral monopoly, and it's one of the most fascinating and nuanced situations in all of labor economics. Today, we're going to break it down completely because the AP exam absolutely loves to test whether you understand what happens when market power sits on both sides of the table. Building on what you already know. Before we dig in, let's make sure your foundation is solid, because bilateral monopoly is really a synthesis of two earlier concepts you've already studied: monopsony and monopoly unions. If you remember from your work on monopsony, a single employer with labor market power hires fewer workers than a competitive market would, and it pays a wage below the marginal revenue product of labor. The monopsonist's hiring rule is to set the marginal resource cost equal to the marginal revenue product, MRC equals MRP. But because the labor supply curve slopes upward, the MRC curve lies above the supply curve. This drives wages down below competitive levels. On the flip side, a monopoly union uses its collective bargaining power to push wages above the competitive equilibrium. The union acts essentially like a monopoly seller, targeting some wage above where supply meets demand, often the wage that maximizes the total wage bill, or the wage at which demand for labor intersects the union's desired outcome. In a bilateral monopoly, both forces are operating simultaneously. The monopsonist wants to push wages down. The union wants to push wages up. Neither side gets to be the unchallenged price setter. So what actually happens? The indeterminate outcome, the key insight. Here's the central exam concept you must lock in. The wage and employment level in a bilateral monopoly are theoretically indeterminate. That's the word College Board wants you to use. Indeterminate, unlike a competitive market, which gives you a clean equilibrium, or even a pure monopsony, which gives you a predictable below-competitive outcome. Bilateral monopoly lands in a range. The actual wage will fall somewhere between the wage the monopsonist would prefer to pay, the monopsony wage, which is below competitive, and the wage the union would prefer to receive, the union wage, which is above competitive. The final outcome depends on the relative bargaining power of the two sides. Think of it like two kids splitting a pizza. The monopsony employer wants to give the workers a tiny slice. The union wants the biggest slice it can get. The final cut depends on who negotiates harder, who has more leverage, better alternatives, and stronger patience for a standoff. Drawing the graph. This will appear on FRQs. You need to be able to draw and label this graph from memory, so let's walk through it carefully. Start by drawing a standard labor market diagram with the quantity of labor on the horizontal axis and the wage rate on the vertical axis. First, draw an upward-sloping labor supply curve S, which also represents the average resource cost of labor to the employer. Above it, draw the marginal resource cost curve MRC, which is steeper than the supply curve and lies above it. This reflects the monopsonist's reality that hiring one more worker means paying all workers a higher wage. Next, draw a downward-sloping marginal revenue product of labor curve, MRP, which also serves as the labor demand curve. Now, here's where the bilateral monopoly story plays out visually. The monopsonist, acting alone, would set MRC equal to MRP to find the profit-maximizing quantity of workers. Drop down from that intersection to the supply curve to find the monopsony wage label, this WMS. This is the lowest wage in our range. The union, acting alone, would target a wage higher than competitive, typically where the labor demand curve, MRP, intersects whatever wage maximizes the union's objective. For the AP exam, the most common framing is that the union targets the competitive wage, where S intersects MRP, or a wage even higher. Label the union's preferred wage competitive WU at the top of your range. The competitive equilibrium wage, WC, where S meets MRP, sits somewhere between these two extremes. The actual bilateral monopoly wage is indeterminate. Use shade or indicate the range between WM and WA, and note the final wage depends on bargaining. One critical exam point, compared to the pure monopsony outcome, the presence of a union in a bilateral monopoly will raise both the wage and employment toward or even to the competitive level. This is a key insight. A union can actually correct some of the inefficiency created by monopsony power, which means bilateral monopoly can produce an outcome closer to the socially efficient result than monopsony alone. Common MCQ traps and how to dodge them. The College Board loves to test whether you understand that indeterminate does not mean no outcome occurs. It means the model alone cannot predict a specific wage, only the direction of the range. If an MCQ asks what wage results from bilateral monopoly, and you see an answer like the competitive wage presented as definitive, be careful. The correct framing is that the wage will be between the monopsony wage and the union-preferred wage. Another trap involves employment levels. Students often assume that because the wage is pushed up by the union, employment must fall below what a monopsonist would hire. Not necessarily, because the union also removes the monopsonist's downward wage suppression. Employment can actually increase relative to the pure monopsony case. Always compare against the monopsony baseline, not just the competitive baseline. Also watch out for conflating bilateral monopoly with oligopsony or other imperfect competition structures. Bilateral monopoly is specifically one buyer and one organized seller, not a few buyers, not unorganized workers. Connections across the course. Bilateral monopoly sits at the intersection of Unit 5's factor markets and the broader theme of market power that runs through Units 3 and 4. The logic of MRC equals MRP echoes the monopolist's MR equals MC rule from product markets. Same framework, different context. And the welfare analysis here connects directly to deadweight loss and efficiency concepts you studied in earlier unit. When bargaining brings wages toward the competitive level, deadweight loss shrinks, which is an allocative efficiency improvement. Exactly the kind of connection that earns points on FRQ Part D analysis questions. With bilateral monopoly in your toolkit, you now have the complete picture of how labor market power operates from both sides of the market, and that sets you up beautifully for synthesizing all of Unit 5 as you move into your final exam preparation. 5.16 Labor unions and their effects on wages and employment. What a union actually is and why it matters. Imagine you work at a factory and your boss offers you a wage you think is too low. You could walk into the manager's office alone and demand more money, but what leverage do you really have? Not much. Now imagine every single worker in that factory walks in together and says the same thing. Suddenly, the power dynamic shifts completely. That is the essential logic of a labor union. Workers acting as a collective bargaining unit to gain market power they simply wouldn't have as individuals. For the AP exam, you need to understand exactly how that shift in market power changes the equilibrium wage and employment level, and why the direction of that change isn't always as simple as it first appears. A labor union is an organization of workers that negotiates collectively with employers over wages, benefits, and working conditions. When a union successfully bargains, the result is a wage that sits above what a purely competitive labor market would produce. This is the key insight. Unions act as a kind of monopoly on the supply side of the labor market. Just as a monopolist in a product market restricts output to raise price, a union restricts the quantity of labor supplied, or at least credibly threatens to do so, in order to push wages above the competitive equilibrium. The graph you must know cold. Here's the graph the College Board loves to put on both the MCQ and the FRQ sections. So let's walk through it carefully. Start with a standard competitive labor market. You have a downward-sloping labor demand curve, which, remember from earlier in Unit 5, represents the marginal revenue product of labor, and an upward-sloping labor supply curve. Without any union, the market clears at the competitive equilibrium wage, W sub C, and employment level, Q sub C, right at the intersection of supply and demand. Now, introduce a union. The union negotiates a wage floor, let's call it W sub U, that sits above W sub C. Draw a horizontal line at W sub U extending from the y-axis. This horizontal line now becomes the effective labor supply curve up until it intersects with the original supply curve. Think of it as a two-part supply curve, perfectly elastic at W sub U until you hit the original supply curve. Then the supply curve continues as normal above that point. What happens? At the higher union wage W sub U, firms demand less labor. You can read this directly off the demand curve. Employment falls to Q sub D, which is less than Q sub C. At the same time, more workers want to work at the higher wage, so the quantity of labor supplied increases to Q sub dash S. The gap between Q sub dash and Q sub D represents a labor surplus. Workers who want jobs at the union wage but can't find them. This surplus looks visually identical to any other price floor above equilibrium, so connect this immediately to your Unit 1 knowledge about price floors. The union wage is simply a price floor in the labor market. Make sure you can label all of these on your diagram. W sub C, W sub U, Q sub C, Q sub D, Q sub S, the labor surplus, and the deadweight loss triangle that forms between Q sub D and Q sub C. The College Board FRQ rubric will award specific points for each labeled element, so don't shortchange your diagram. The trade-off at the heart of union economics. Here's the nuance that separates a score of 3 from a score of 5. Unions raise wages for employed union members, but they simultaneously reduce employment. This trade-off is not a bug. It's a fundamental mechanism. Employed union workers are better off. Workers who lose their jobs or can't enter the unionized sector are worse off. This is also why unions generate deadweight loss from a purely efficiency standpoint. Though many economists and policymakers argue the social benefits in terms of worker bargaining power, reduced income inequality, and improved workplace safety can justify that cost. Unions in a monopsony setting. The edge case that shows up constantly. Now, here's where it gets really interesting, and where the AP exam loves to trip students up. What if the labor market isn't competitive on the employer side either? What if the employer is a monopsonist, a single buyer of labor? Remember from Section 5.14 that a monopsonist pays a wage below the competitive equilibrium and hires fewer workers, creating its own deadweight loss. When a union enters a monopsonistic labor market, something counterintuitive can happen. A union-negotiated wage above the monopsony wage but below the competitive wage can actually increase both wages and employment simultaneously. This is the bilateral monopoly or countervailing power scenario. The intuition is that the union's wage floor eliminates the monopsonist's ability to exploit its market power by restricting hiring. The monopsonist no longer has an incentive to hire fewer workers to drive down the wage. The wage is already set by the contract, so employment can actually rise toward the competitive level. This is a classic MCQ trap. The question will describe a union entering a monopsonistic labor market and ask what happens to wages and employment. Students who only memorize the competitive market scenario will answer, wages rise, employment falls, and they'll get it wrong. The correct answer, at least up to the competitive wage, is wages rise, employment rises. The College Board has tested this distinction explicitly, so you must know both scenarios and be able to identify which one the question is describing. Connecting to the rest of the course. Labor unions connect to several other major themes in AP Microeconomics. The wage floor they create is a direct application of price floor analysis from Unit 1. The concept of MRP-driven labor demand ties directly to your earlier work in Unit 5 on derived demand and factor markets. The deadweight loss triangle echoes the efficiency losses you studied in Unit 2 with taxes and price controls. And the monopsony interaction brings together two different sources of market power, monopoly on the supply side of labor and monopsony on the demand side, which is itself a Unit 4 and Unit 5 synthesis question. On FRQs, if you're asked to show the effect of a union, draw the graph, label it precisely, identify the wage and employment outcomes, and explicitly state whether there is a surplus or shortage of labor. If the context involves a monopsonist, flag that explicitly and explain the countervailing power logic that one paragraph of explanation is often worth 2 or 3 rubric points on its own. The big takeaway, unions use collective bargaining power to set wages above competitive equilibrium, which raises wages for employed members but reduces total employment and creates deadweight loss unless the countervailing monopsony case applies, in which case both wages and employment can increase together. With that understanding of how market power shapes wages in labor markets, you're perfectly set up to explore how governments intervene in those same markets through minimum wage laws, our next stop in the course. 5.17 Physical capital and land as factor markets. What these factor markets are really about. Okay, so here's where things get really interesting. You've already learned how labor markets work. Employers hire workers up to the point where the marginal revenue product of labor equals the wage. Well, good news, the logic is exactly the same for physical capital and land. The framework doesn't change. What changes is the nature of what's being bought, sold, or rented. And that difference in nature creates a few wrinkles you absolutely need to know for the exam. Let's start with physical capital. When economists say physical capital, they mean the tools, machinery, equipment, and structures used in production. Think a tractor on a farm, a conveyor belt in a factory, or a commercial oven in a bakery. This is not financial capital, that's money or stocks, and that distinction is a classic AP trap. If a free response question asks about the physical capital market and you start writing about interest rates on loans, you've already lost points. Physical capital is the stuff used to make other stuff. Land, on the other hand, refers to all natural resources, not just plots of ground, but timber, mineral deposits, water rights, and the like. For the AP exam, you mostly think of land as a fixed supply factor, and that fixed supply is the single most important thing you need to remember about it. The rental rate and the investment decision. Here's where you need to introduce two related but distinct ideas, the rental market for capital and the investment decision. Firms that use physical capital can either rent it or purchase it outright. When a firm rents a piece of equipment, say a construction company leasing excavators, the price it pays is called the rental rate. When a firm considers buying capital, it has to think about whether the investment is worth it, and that brings in the concept of the interest rate as the opportunity cost of funds. But here's the AP relevant core. Regardless of whether a firm rents or buys capital, the decision rule is the same as labor. The firm demands capital up to the point where the marginal revenue product of capital, MRPK, equals the rental rate, or the cost of using that unit of capital. Write that down and tattoo it on your brain. MRPK equals rental rate. That's the profit maximizing condition for capital usage. MRPK is calculated just like MRPL. You take the marginal physical product of capital, how many additional units of output that next machine produces, and multiply it by the price of the output. MRPK equals MPPK times price of output. If a new forklift helps a warehouse ship 200 more packages per month, and each package earns the firm $3 in revenue, then the MRP of that forklift is $600 per month. If renting the forklift costs $500 a month, you rent it. If it costs $700 a month, you don't. Simple. Drawing the capital market graph. The graph for the physical capital market looks almost identical to the labor market graph, and you should be able to draw it in your sleep. Put the rental rate on the vertical axis and the quantity of capital on the horizontal axis. The demand curve for capital slopes downward. This is because of the law of diminishing marginal returns. As a firm adds more and more machines, each additional machine contributes a little less to output, so firms are only willing to pay lower and lower rental rates for additional units. The supply curve for capital slopes upward in the short run, reflecting that it takes time and resources to produce more machines and equipment. The equilibrium rental rate and quantity of capital are determined where supply meets demand, just like any other market. Now, here's an important exam connection. If the price of the firm's output increases, what happens in the capital market? The demand for capital increases, the whole demand curve shifts, right? Because a higher output price raises MRPK at every quantity level. This is a classic derived demand story, and it shows up in both multiple choice and free response questions. Demand for factors is derived from the demand for the good being produced, so anything that changes output demand ripples back into the factor market. The land market and its perfectly inelastic supply. Now, land is where the story gets a bit unusual, and where the exam loves to test you. The defining characteristic of land as a factor of production is that its supply is perfectly inelastic. The supply curve is a vertical line. There is only so much land on Earth, and no matter how high the rental rate climbs, you simply cannot create more of it. This is one of the few genuinely vertical supply curves you'll encounter in this course. What does a perfectly inelastic supply curve mean for how price, in this case the rent paid for land, is determined? It means rent is determined entirely by demand. The supply doesn't respond at all. If developers suddenly want to build luxury condominiums along a coastline, driving up demand for oceanfront land, the rental rate for that land skyrockets, but the quantity of land stays exactly the same. The economist David Ricardo called this economic rent, which is any payment to a factor of production in excess of its opportunity cost. Because land has essentially no alternative use in the aggregate. It can't be produced by raising its price. The entire payment for land is often considered economic rent. On your graph, draw a vertical supply curve for land with the rental rate on the vertical axis and quantity of land on the horizontal axis. The demand curve still slopes downward for the same MRP reasons. Equilibrium rental rate is read straight across from wherever demand intersects that vertical supply line. When demand increases, the rental rate goes up, but quantity stays fixed. That's the key visual story the exam wants you to be able to interpret. Common traps and connections to watch for. Here are the traps that catch students most often. First, don't confuse financial capital with physical capital. The AP exam uses capital to mean machinery and equipment, not money. Second, students often forget that the MRP equals factor price decision rule applies identically to capital and land as it does to labor, and they try to invent a new rule. There is no new rule. Third, when a question changes the interest rate rather than the rental rate, it's typically asking about the investment decision, whether to buy capital, not the rental market itself. Those are related but different scenarios. This topic connects tightly to Unit 5's other factor market content. Everything you learned about labor markets is your scaffolding here, and it also loops back to Unit 3's production and cost concepts, especially diminishing marginal returns, which is the very reason factor demand curves slope downward. It also previews ideas about income distribution because the wages, rental rates, and returns flowing to labor, capital, and land explain how income gets divided among the factors of production. With physical capital and land markets now in your toolkit, you're ready to bring it all together as we look at how income gets distributed across all factor markets and what determines the functional distribution of income in an economy. 5.18 MRP calculations and factor market practice problems. All right, let's get into the work. The actual problem solving that shows up on your AP exam and separates the students who understand factor markets from the students who can genuinely score on them. Think of this section as your practice gym. We've covered the theory, now we're going to build the muscle memory. The core formula you cannot live without. Let's start by cementing the foundation. The marginal revenue product formula is MRP equals MP times MR, where MP is the marginal product of the input and MR is the marginal revenue the firm earns from selling that additional output. For a firm in a perfectly competitive output market, MR equals price. So the formula simplifies to MRP equals MP times P. College Board uses both versions, so you need to recognize them interchangeably. Here's the everyday version of this idea. Imagine you hire one more barista at your coffee shop. That barista makes 20 additional lattes per hour. That's the marginal product. And each latte sells for $5, that's the price, which equals MR in a competitive market. So the MRP of that barista is $100 per hour. That $100 is the dollar value that one additional worker adds to your revenue. Beautiful. Now, would you hire that barista if they cost you $80 an hour? Absolutely. You're making a $20 profit on the decision. Would you hire them at $110 an hour? No, because you'd be losing $10 per hour. This intuition is your hiring decision rule, and it leads us directly to the firm's golden condition. Hire until MRP equals MRC, where MRC is the marginal resource cost. Walking through a complete MRP table. On the AP exam, you will almost certainly encounter a data table showing labor inputs, total product, marginal product, output price, and you'll need to derive MRP values. Let's walk through how to attack that table systematically. Say you're given that with 3 workers, total output is 24 units, and with 4 workers, total output is 30 units. The marginal product of the 4th worker is 30 minus 24 equals 6 units. If the output price is $4, then MRP equals 6 times 4 equals $24. If the wage, MRC, is $20, you hire that 4th worker. Now with 5 workers, suppose total product is 34, marginal product is only 4, so MRP equals 4 times $4 is $16. Since 16 is less than the $20 wage, you do not hire the 5th worker. Your profit-maximizing labor input is 4 workers. This is exactly the logic College Board wants you to demonstrate, and it's tested constantly in both multiple choice and free response sections. A critical edge case to watch for: what happens when MRP exactly equals MRC? You hire that unit, the firm is indifferent, but the technically correct answer under the MRP equals MRC rule is to employ it. Exam writers love setting up this scenario to see if you'll flinch. Drawing the factor market graph. You absolutely must be able to draw and interpret the factor market graph, sometimes called the labor market graph, for the firm. Here's how to build it from scratch. Draw your axes with the wage rate, W, on the vertical axis and quantity of labor, L, on the horizontal axis. In a perfectly competitive labor market, the firm is a wage taker, meaning the labor supply curve it faces is a perfectly horizontal, flat line at the market wage. This line is simultaneously the supply of labor and the MRC. Your MRP curve slopes downward, reflecting the law of diminishing marginal returns. Where MRP intersects the horizontal MRC line, that's your profit-maximizing quantity of labor, labeled L star. This graph is the factor market equivalent of the MR equals MC graph from Unit 3, and College Board expects you to treat it with the same rigor. For a monopsonist, a firm that is the only buyer of labor, the MRC curve lies above the labor supply curve, because hiring one more worker means paying a higher wage to all workers. This causes the monopsonist to hire less labor and pay a lower wage than a competitive market would produce, creating a deadweight loss. If you're asked to shade welfare loss on a monopsony graph, it's the triangle between the competitive outcome and the monopsony outcome bounded by the MRP and supply curves. This is one of the most challenging graph interpretations on the exam, so practice drawing it several times. Common traps and how to dodge them. The most common MCQ trap in this entire topic is confusing total revenue product with marginal revenue product. Total revenue product is just output multiplied by price for the total quantity produced. It tells you total revenue, not the additional revenue from one more unit of input. When a question asks how much an additional worker contributes, you always want MRP, not TRP. Reading carefully pays off here. A second major trap involves firms in imperfectly competitive output markets. Think monopolies or oligopolies. In those cases, MR is less than price, which means MRP equals MP times MR is less than MP times P. Students frequently forget this and use the product price instead of marginal revenue when calculating MRP for a monopoly firm. The consequence is that they overestimate MRP and think the firm hires more than it actually does. On the AP exam, if a question mentions the firm has market power in the product market, That's your signal to use MR, not P. A third trap. Don't confuse the input market graph with the output market graph. The MRP curve is the firm's demand for labor, not its supply of output. When you're in a factor market diagram, you're analyzing decisions about inputs. Mixing up which market you're in is a common source of lost points on FRQs. Connecting back to the bigger picture. This topic sits at the intersection of everything you've learned. The concept of diminishing marginal returns, Unit 3, explains why the MRP curve slopes downward. The MR equals MC rule from product markets mirrors the MRP equals MRC rule here. Same logic, different variables. Monopsony power in input markets parallels monopoly power in output markets. Both restrict quantity and create deadweight loss. When you're writing an FRQ about efficiency or welfare, you can draw these connections explicitly and earn those analysis points that many students miss. The MRP equals MRC framework also connects directly to wage determination and income distribution topics. College Board may link to discussions of minimum wage, unions, or labor market interventions in the final stretches of Unit 5. With your MRP calculations locked in, you're ready to zoom out and look at how all the factor market concepts come together in the broader context of income distribution and economic equity, which is exactly where we're headed.